So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Ungar, and I am one of the founders of the Industry 4.0 Club. And the club itself exists to advance the deployment of Industry 4.0. I'm really glad to be here with you today as we do our fireside chat and talk with Tim Stuart. Before we introduce Tim and talk more about him, I would like to introduce my co-host, Mike Yost. Mike, could you introduce yourself briefly, please?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for being here, Tim. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mike Yost. Along with Mike, I'm one of the co-founders of the Industry 4.0 Club. I'm also the CEO at the moment and co-host here of these regular events. So really looking forward to the conversation with Tim here today.
Thanks, Mike. Tim, so just our special guest today is Tim Stuart. Tim has been involved in the deployment of Lean Industry 4.0 for quite some time. He's been leading an organization called Visual Decisions for over 2 decades now and has a wealth of experience. Tim, could you talk a minute about Visual Decisions and just what you do?
Sure.
And welcome.
Oh, thanks. So Visual Decisions, we've been working to gather information from the shop floor and use that to improve operations for, as you said, over 20 years now. And we started off working with some of the basic systems at the time, back in the early 2000s, where it was just kind of the beginning of OEE systems and things like that collected data, working with MES applications at certain customers. And how do you take that information and then drive real improvement with it? And I came from both a lean manufacturing background as well as an enterprise software background. And so for me, it was how do you combine those things successfully in order to drive the results? And we'll talk about that more as we go.
Fantastic. You mean you can combine Lean and Industry 4.0? I mean, really?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. A lot of Lean practitioners are struggle with that. So I'm anxious to get into that conversation a bit more.
Yep.
So when we talk about you talk about your work at Visual Decisions, just for another minute, when you're not working in the company, what is it you like to do? Where do you spend your time?
I used to spend most of my time off of work with my kids, but they're grown and out of the house now. So now I have to find other things to do with my time. So I find myself doing a lot of reading. I enjoy doing actual courses and things like that on Coursera and edX and things like that. But I also love sports. I love watching them, playing them as much as I can, but harder these days. And just having a good time.
Well, that's fantastic. So,
hey, Mike, just real quick, I can tell you too from personal experience. I know Tim spends a lot of time giving of himself and creating content. So we'll give his credentials at the end as far as how to track him down. But he has a ton of content on this subject matter available. So he's a machine in cranking that types of content out. And I drag him into all sorts of free initiatives where I beg of his time to help us think through how we can scale help through the Industry 4.0 Club and other nonprofit organizations and initiatives that are going on.
Yeah. We'll figure out the whole scaling part at some point.
We'll get there.
I hear you. So when you mentioned being involved with Visual Decisions for 20 plus years, I imagine 20 plus years ago, I know we weren't talking about Industry 4.0.
Right.
So can you, when you think back, when did you start realizing that Lean and Industry 4.0 go together? When did that sort of aha moment strike you?
Well, I mean, the data connectivity pieces and so forth have evolved over time. The technology has changed, and the labeling of it as Industry 4.0 has changed and so forth. But as early as 2005, I was using an application called Informance, which was just a dedicated OEE system to use photo eyes to watch materials going by on a line and so forth and figure out what the OEE was. We had interactive screens where the operators could tag the reasons for downtime and so forth. And so you had that fundamental data collection happening, all the way back then. And as I was working with those systems, For me, the aha moment was seeing customers put it in and not get the value that they were expecting from it afterwards. And trying to figure out why. It was they're not integrating it into people's daily lives as much as they should. The successful customers were doing a lot of things like every Tuesday they would have a TPM event, utilize that data and make improvements. But the companies that weren't doing those things to integrate it into the process were not having as much success. So that was the aha moment for me.
So just real quick, we've already thrown out a couple different acronyms. I just want to clean them up for those following around. So let's go backwards. So you did TPM, MES, and OEE are 3 acronyms that you've thrown out. So talk about TPM just quickly and then tie it in with that point you were making.
Sure. TPM is total productive maintenance, and it is a kind of a subset of lean. It's how do you organize your maintenance activities within your organization? How do you track those? How do you ensure that you are doing the right preventive maintenance tasks and so forth? Are you pushing towards autonomous maintenance with your operators? A lot of different things underneath that structure of TPM. And that ties in because as you're looking at what are those maintenance activities that you should be doing, the more that you can use data to inform that decision, the better off you are. And the ultimate goal is to keep those machines up and running as much as possible. Maintenance activities, maintenance related downtime and breakdowns and so forth are only a portion of that total downtime, but it is a critical portion, and you can impact that by improving the way that you do those TPM activities. Excellent.
And I think that illustrates the point that you're making as far as having a program, having an outcome you're looking for under this umbrella of TPM, or potentially other types of initiatives as well, and then putting the technology in the proper place to support that initiative and the outcomes that you're looking for from that perspective.
Exactly.
So just quickly, for those that may not be familiar, MES stands for Manufacturing Execution Systems, which is plant level solutions, and OEE stands for Overall Equipment Effectiveness, which is a metric that a lot of people monitor to look at the overall performance of equipment lines, facilities, et cetera. Yep. So, Mike, back to you.
Yeah, and so we were talking TPM, so we had a question already from Karen.
Sure.
Maybe we can, maybe you can talk to that for a moment. So what are some of the common challenges organizations face in implementing TPM, and how can these challenges be overcome? So would you mind taking that?
Sure. So I'll focus more on the TPM and integrating it in with some of these different technologies and so forth. Part of the problems that companies face when implementing TPM is a lack of direction with it, and cultural issues, getting everybody on board and so forth. But in terms of, how do you know that you're doing the right tasks? How do you know from a preventive maintenance point of view that the things that you're putting in that schedule are effective, that they're on the right periodicity and so forth? You're doing them as frequently as they need to be, but not any more frequent than that. Those are things that if you're trying to do that without data, you're really doing best guesses and estimates and so forth. And you can do a lot of manual engineering studies to do that. But then if things change over time, you either have to do another study or you have to do those best guess adjustments and so forth. For something like autonomous maintenance, where you're trying to have the operators take on as much of the routine maintenance tasks as possible, then it's, how do you inform the operators when those tasks are supposed to happen? How do you have instructions available to them? If you have job rotations or absences taking place for an operator that may not be at that station all the time, how do you let them know what are those autonomous maintenance tasks and how should they be performed and so forth? And so having systems in place that are integrated with this, with your TPM program, can help you ease all of that. You can understand from the data how frequently the TPM or the preventive maintenance tasks should be run. You can continuously monitor those to see if they're having the impact that you want them to have. You can measure the effectiveness of those programs. And then with autonomous maintenance, you can supply work instructions to the operator. You can prompt them for what work should be done that day, how it should be done, and so forth. And so it makes things a lot easier. There's also a lot of visual controls that come along with TPM. So you have TPM towers where you display a variety of different metrics and so forth. And it's typically an awful lot of manual work to maintain the information on those towers. And so you can automate that process using a lot of these systems and utilizing electronic visual controls.
So Tim, one of the points, the beauty of Industry 4.0 with the communications technologies and the sensors and such is that it breaks down silos, right? And like there's data everywhere, and now it's easy to go and get it. Back to Karen's point about questions around challenges to overcome. What's your experience with organizational challenges? So is TPM a company-wide, plant-wide initiative? Is it owned by the maintenance team? If it's owned by the maintenance team, does it align with the continuous improvement folks or the quality folks? Maybe talk about the organizational challenges.
Great point. And so TPM as an initiative really should be throughout pretty much everybody working within the facility, and ideally as a corporate initiative. And often it is started either by the maintenance team or by some subset within there. And you don't get that communication, that participation from all of the different groups that you're really hoping for as part of that process. And that leads to a lack of optimization of a lot of these things, a lack of communication that's happening. You don't get the synchronization between the engineering efforts and what you're doing within the maintenance group and so forth. And again, implementing these systems gives you the opportunity to get everybody in sync. And as you're doing this initiative of implementing Industry 4.0, you have the opportunity to now get involvement from all of those different people and get them all on the same page of how the information is going to be used to drive those improvements, to drive that program going forward.
Yeah, I think that's great insight. And there's a lot of conversation nowadays about, a mindset, a new mindset to be a modern day manufacturer that I think really hits at the point you're talking about, that it needs to be, you need to build digital capabilities as an organization as opposed to buying, standalone solutions. So it's really, I guess, if I think back over the last couple of decades that I've been here graying in this space as well, we used to be afraid of the culture conversation. I can remember very distinctly having conversations inside of another nonprofit that I worked with. And anytime culture came up, people said, no, that's too big for us. We can't have that conversation here. But you mentioned culture in your response, and I'm wondering if you could just talk about that, because to take a view like you just talked about really comes back to what is the culture of the company and what are we going to do if we have this information? Because I can show you something, and if you're not going to take any action against it, well, then it's not going to drive the results that you're looking for. So maybe I think nowadays we're much more aware that we have to address the culture issues, and so maybe if you could just reflect on your thoughts about how culture plays a role in the success of these implementations.
Oh, absolutely. And for me, it's core of everything that we do in our approach, because the analogy that I use all the time is a Fitbit. And I've been wearing a Fitbit for over 10 years now, and I've gained at least 20 pounds during that time. And it's not the Fitbit's fault, right? The Fitbit does exactly what it should be doing.
Right.
It collects all that data, it pushes it to the cloud-based application. You have analytics there that turn all the raw sensor data into footsteps and heartbeats and everything else. And it gives you all kinds of pretty charts and graphs on your phone, on your computer, wherever you want them. But if you don't change your behaviors, if fundamentally you don't do something differently tomorrow than you do today, then you're not going to get any benefit from it. You're not going to lose the weight. And it's the exact same thing on the shop floor. You can put these sensors in place. You can put IoT system in place. You can do video analytics. You can do whatever you want. But if you don't change the behaviors of the people that are in the plant, not just the operators, but everybody, then you're not going to get the improvements that you're hoping for. And so what you have to look at is, how do you actually go about getting the adoption? How do you go about changing the behaviors? What is it that you want to do differently than you do today? And how do you get that to happen?
So quick question on that. Are you seeing companies that want to change? Like honestly, like if a company isn't willing to make the change, we can hand out all the free Fitbits we want. Or I prefer the ordering, but like, are companies you're dealing with saying, you give me the information in a timely fashion in the context I need it, and then I will commit to supporting my people to drive the change or follow the data where it leads me?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a friend from Texas who says this in a bit of a stronger way, but there's two kinds of companies that are highly incented to change: the ones that are kicking butt and the ones that are getting their butts kicked. And I find that those companies are the ones that are kicking butt are typically pretty forward thinking, that are thinking, okay, how can we take this to the next level at all times? And those are the ones that kind of have that plan, that are saying, okay, here's the things that we want to do, and now we need to put the technology in place to do that. The ones that are having their butts kicked are looking for answers, and they're much more willing to change their mindset about how to go about these different things. A lot of the ones in the middle maybe not as anxious to make change sometimes.
I hear that.
That's it. Yeah. So you keep talking about culture change,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to be funny and say I'm getting a little bit lost, because I thought we were talking about Industry 4.0. So bring us back to how these come together again, one more time.
Sure. So going back to the analogy of the Fitbit and relating that to IoT and so forth, just as an easy example. So when you're implementing an IoT system, and I've put the sensors out in place, I've handled the connectivity, I've got all of that information into a database, I've got my analytics going, I've got predictive capabilities in place and so forth. What do I do now? So all the technology's there, all the technology's working, it's doing exactly what the vendor told me it would do and so forth. But I don't have anything different in my performance yet. So how do I actually now make things better as an organization? I have to start using that data, but it's not just the operators looking at that and having a visual control and deciding based on the predictive capabilities when I'm going to take the machine down for maintenance and so forth. It's how does my engineering team utilize that information for driving variability out of the process? So variability is at the root cause of every quality issue. And so if I'm trying to improve my quality, how do I identify what are the sources of variability in the process, and how do I mitigate or eliminate those different sources of variability? Having the data coming from the system gives me that ability to do that type of analysis, but somebody still has to actually go out and do it. So how do you make this part of their daily job? How do you take the activities that you're already doing with lean manufacturing and so forth, or Six Sigma programs, and now utilize this information that's available in these systems to improve how you do that improvement process? And those are the things that you're changing the way that people do their jobs, what their jobs entail. Hopefully you're making things easier for them to accomplish the tasks that they're already trying to accomplish. Every company in the world is trying to improve efficiency. Every company in the world is trying to improve quality and so forth. But how do you make that more effective? How do you take the tasks that they're doing and make those tasks themselves more effective, and or give them the ability to do things that they simply couldn't do before?
Yeah, that's a great comment. I'm going to share a couple of comments we've got coming in from folks that are listening to us live. Alan takes a moment and just kind of reinforces your comment about Fitbits. and he highlights again this question of if the behaviors aren't changing to integrate the tools, the toolkits, then technology is not going to help. So it's about behavior ultimately. And then I think so. Rhiannon, I hope I didn't mispronounce your name. Talks about Kotter's change model, and as a first step, and I think that's also a really good point. About with Kotter, I think it was 8 steps in that process, doesn't he?
7-step process for Kotter.
7 steps. Okay, I lost track. Maybe I had about 8. I don't know, but so 7 steps. But that's really cool. Thank you, Verona, for that reflection. That's fantastic. When I think about change, this idea of change, we've talked about how you do that in organizations. I've always wrestled with one point, and I'm curious to get your feedback on this.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I want to change, and I've got a pretty large organization. So I've got leadership to consider. I've got the frontline workers to consider. I've got the middle management to consider. Where do I start? I mean, you can't do everything at once, right? It would be too costly. I can't just shut everybody down and bring everybody into a classroom and say, let's go. What are your thoughts on how do you deal with the multiple levels in a factory or in an organization like that for change?
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that it's most effective when you start from the top. The leadership tends to set, the culture tends to set the direction and so forth. So if you have them leading by example, them doing the things that they want everybody else to do do the Gandhi thing and be the change that they want in the plant, then to me, that's the most effective thing. But they actually have to live it as well. They can't just say, hey, I want you guys to go do this, but I'm not going to change. So if they're living it, it's most effective, I think, to start from the top, and then to hold their people to those same things that they're doing. I don't think that's the only way that change can happen, though. I think you can start at the middle or at kind of the bottom levels of the organization and change that culture, working your way up and down and across and so forth. I think it just takes more time. And I think eventually you have to get the buy-in of those people at the top so that they reinforce the things that you want to have happen.
So Tim, if somebody's out there that is not in the leadership or ownership position, and they're trying to convince others of the value of this, do you recommend a technology-centric discussion? We should go buy this stuff. We have lots of sensors, Fitbits for everybody. Or what do you recommend?
If you're trying to convince management to do anything, start with the money. This is going to make the company more profitable if we do these things. And for me, in my experience, it's almost always more effective talking about what are the results that we're looking for. What are the process changes that we're going to be able to put in place that enable those different results? What are the impediments to that improved performance that we see today? What are those root causes for the current level of performance? And how are the process changes that we're talking about going to directly address those root causes for the current performance? And then the technology is really just the enabler that's going to help put those process changes in place.
Yeah, I used to spend a lot of time with a nonprofit called Mesa International, and they've been around for 3 decades. One of the things that I noticed there, I created a 4-blocker a long time ago where the bottom axis was how do you deploy these technologies, and the right side of the axis was why do you deploy these. And then we scaled it from the plant level to the enterprise level. And so we were always looking at the different audiences in those boxes and the different stories you tell in those boxes. And one of the things that was really telling to me is that the board was always looking at the higher level, like, why are we doing this at an enterprise level? And organically, what the committees, working groups, people from all around the world, they were hitting on the point that you are, that we need to start talking about why we're doing this at the plant level, right? And so there's been a lot of work done with, I think just people are recognizing that. So I think that's certainly in alignment with what you're talking about. I was going to try to switch us, no, not necessarily switch us, but we labeled this conversation the do's and don'ts of Industry 4.0 solutions. So pick a path. We should take us down a path of some do's, and then we'll look at some don'ts, or vice versa if you prefer.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about a lot of do's so far, right? And those are really the key things that I would really emphasize as we move forward is start off the project looking at what are the things that you're trying to accomplish, what are the root causes for lack of performance in those areas, and now think through what are the process changes that you're going to have to put in place, what are the behavioral changes that you're going to have to put in place to really address those root causes, and then finally at the end come through and think through now what are the different technologies that we need to have in place in order to support those process and behavioral changes. It should never actually start with the technology and say, okay, now what do we do with this? Okay. Yeah, we bought an IoT system, great. What do we do with it?
That's a fantastic lead into this next question. I think Rhiannon has a great question. It's something I was going to go down the road on a little bit, because you talked about change. We talked about different management levels, but one other approach is this idea about pilots or skunk works. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that as an approach to get started or to create change? And should you always start small with a pilot, or do you try to go across the enterprise at a certain level? Tell me, what are your thoughts there?
Great question. In terms of, I think of this, work with a lot of different technology vendors, and they all have the same issue with POCs or pilots and so forth, POC, proof of concept, where they'll do this with a customer and it won't ever really go anywhere. And what I always emphasize to both the manufacturers and my technology partners is that before you start a pilot or a proof of concept, you have to differentiate. Are you doing a technology proof of concept, or are you actually saying, can we make a change in the business as a result of having this technology in place? If all you're trying to do is to say, hey, in our environment, does this IoT system actually collect the data? Can we connect to our machines? Can we get the information pulled? Do we have sufficient bandwidth on the network to be able to handle this at low latency and so forth? Great. If that's all you're trying to do is a technology proof of concept, all you have to do is put the technology in place, see if it works. If what you're trying to do is to say, are we going to drive change in the business as a result of having this proof of concept or this pilot run, then you have to start thinking through all of these things that we've been talking about around behavioral change and so forth on that smaller scale, because it can be really hard when you run a pilot to ask people to change the way that they do their jobs based on having this new information available. So just as an example, I worked with a company that implemented things at one station. So they were collecting data on one machine out of 120 or so in the plant. And so after they had this in place, how much attention do you think the maintenance department paid to the data coming from that system compared to everything else in the plant? Do you think that they changed the way that they did the jobs to incorporate looking at that information? For the engineers that were doing continuous improvement projects and so forth, do you think that they were like, hey, we've got this data on this one machine, let's look at that? Or do you think that they were continuing to do things the way that they were based on the fact that 119 machines weren't connected? For the quality department, they weren't changing the way that they were doing their jobs or anything else. And so when you do those pilots, you have to make sure that if you're looking at how much value you're creating, that all of the people that are involved with that machine actually utilize that information to make improvements in that process.
Yeah, it sounds like too that you want to, before you start the pilot, I think what I hear you saying a little bit too is you got to have the end game in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, are you doing it to prove a concept, or do you have intentions, if you get so many results, to deploy this technology more broadly?
Right.
And I think if I think what I hear you saying is if you start with the end in mind before you start the pilot, understand that it'll help you be avoid the what people like to call the pilot purgatory.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. If I could just jump in for a second, Tim, some of the other points we're talking about as far as convincing management, and your earlier point about it being a leadership issue. If you're going to go deploy something, right, you're going to buy Tim a Fitbit, and it doesn't have the results that you're looking for. If that's the end of it all, and you say, well, that stuff didn't work, right? Like, we're not doing an industry 4.0, we're not continuing to digitize, et cetera, because that thing didn't fail. Then you're in the spot that Mike talked about with the pilot purgatory and a start and a stop, versus if you're committed to a path and you go start with a small pilot of some technology. And if that specific technology doesn't prove itself out, well, then, okay, we learned, look at it as a learning opportunity, then come back and say, let's find one that does. But we're continuing on the journey where it's not, the end game in and of itself.
Yeah. Joanne Friedman, I post her message, but it doesn't show through. She had some really great words on LinkedIn. She says it needs to be proof of value, not proof of concept. And that choice of words can be very valuable when you're trying to give that message inside a company. Thank you, Joanne, for that.
Yeah. And when you're doing the proof of value, you have to make sure that all of those things that you need to do over the long term to get the value that we've been discussing in terms of integrating into the process, changing behaviors, and so forth, all take place as part of that pilot. And that can be very difficult to do when it's on a small scale, but it has to be part of the mindset of what you're going to do as you embark on that journey.
Well, and I know Tim has a lot of tools and resources and webinars and videos on the value side of things. Do you think most people have the tools that they need, Tim, to be able to have a value-centric conversation with leadership?
I think that there's information out there that can help them put that together. You mentioned my webinars and so forth, and there's a lot of tools other than mine as well. But I think that there's often engineers are focused on the process itself and how to make things better and so forth. And they don't necessarily have the background to say, what is this actually worth from a financial value perspective?
Yeah.
And so
I just think about all the talk that we talk about with upskilling and reskilling and, future engineers and future operators. To me, that's part of the conversation. We need to be teaching people the business side of manufacturing so that they can have those types of conversations, throughout the business.
Yep.
I just want to take a moment, if I can, and pause and share with our audience. This is the Industry 4.0 Club. This is our weekly or every other week fireside chat. Today, we're talking with Tim Stuart. Tim is the owner and principal with Visual Decisions, with really over 2 decades of experience in integrating lean and Industry 4.0 in helping businesses improve their business results. So again, sorry to interrupt there, but maybe I can get us to talk about, Tim, we've talked a lot about the do's, and Mike mentioned earlier, talk about some of the don'ts. What are some of the things you shouldn't do? What are mistakes people make when looking at Industry 4.0? I know you mentioned one earlier that is focusing first on the technology, but what else comes to mind?
Yeah. So I'm going to cheat, and one of the don'ts that I'll talk about is related to the pilot and kind of extending that pilot. So you've done the pilot, you've decided to move forward. One of the things that you have to decide now is if I'm putting an IoT system or a video analytics or whatever different system that you're talking about, if I'm putting that in place across my plant, do I put that everywhere? Or do I just put it on my critical assets? Or, how do I do that? and it's obviously going to cost more if you put it everywhere. So, there's a tendency to say, I'm just going to put this in the areas where I have problems or where I have critical processes that I need to make sure run effectively. And while I definitely understand that mindset, what that sets you up for is, if you're trying to change the behaviors of the people in the organization, if you're trying to establish a consistent way of doing problem solving, root cause analysis, et cetera, within your organization, if you have information available in some places and you don't have it available in other places, you run the risk of that not really being integrated into the way that people do that problem solving and process improvement within your organization. And so for me, the don't here is don't ignore the ramifications of those decisions as you're deciding how you're going to roll this out. You have to keep in mind, if I'm trying to change the behaviors of my people, if I'm trying to change how we do continuous improvement, if I want to have something that enforces standard work throughout my organization, if I want to have something that changes the way that we do problem solving and so forth, then I have to have that consistency in approach, or consistency of approach, throughout the manufacturing process. And so one of the don'ts that I would coach against is don't put different things in different places and expect people to have a common approach to how they go about their jobs on a daily basis. So that's one don't. The other don't, or another don't, is don't lock into a technology vendor too early. A lot of companies start off by being prompted by some vendor that's calling them up, and whomever it might be, and they start to go down the path of saying, well, we're going to go broader, but we're going to stay with people that sell similar stuff, and they don't really think about it from the end point of view of what are we trying to achieve, and working the way backwards from what are those root causes for the current performance, what are the process changes that we're trying to put in place that address those root causes, and then looking at what are the different technologies that can support that. Because they're starting with the technology in mind, because that's what's prompting this conversation, well, now they start to go down a journey of that mindset.
Yeah. And you're really mentioning, I think this idea of vendor selection, you certainly, I think the dilemma that a lot of folks face is they don't want to become an expert in technology because, there's so many technologies, it's hard to keep up with everything. Mm-hmm. And so you need trusted partners, but a trusted partner isn't going to force you into something that you don't need.
Right.
And so it's finding that right partner who's not going to, I'm going to say sell for selling's sake, but is really there to be your technology expert and sell you when you need it, not when they want to sell it to you.
Yeah. And this is something that Mike and I have actually talked about quite a bit, is, for a company that isn't already expert in this area, doesn't know, what all of those different technologies are that could, provide assistance and so forth. How can they go about doing this analysis? They don't know what the art of the possible is and so forth. And so, how do they get started in this? And, ideally there's, a coach or a mentor that's out there, a Sherpa that will help guide them, up the mountain and so forth. And will be available to, help them navigate that process. For me, that's kind of the ideal situation.
Yeah, and Tim's one of those people. That's why I've been a fan of Tim's for so long. With his approach and his look and his agnostic approach from a tech perspective. But maybe, Tim, just stick with that for a second, because I think it would be a mistake for us to stand here and tell the manufacturing base, that they can't work with solution providers, right? That they can't trust them.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want anybody to take away the fact, and maybe because you live at that intersection, right? You play that role focused on the operations improvements, right? And there comes a point where there's technology to be implemented, and so as soon as you switch to that point, then yeah, you're looking for people you can trust and you work with, and you're all in, and you're training your people on that tech and all that kind of stuff, and it becomes a really tight partnership. And the solution providers bring significant value to the equation. So maybe just talk for a second about where you've seen that kind of connection work. And if there is a disconnect, maybe we just want to be careful that people don't take away that everybody's going to have a disconnect and you're never going to have a good relationship with a solution provider.
And I mean, let me start with this. The vast majority of solution providers out there, whatever technology they're saying, what they say that it does, generally, it actually does those things.
Right.
The vast majority of technology providers provide solid technology that actually can make an impact to a manufacturing organization. So what I'm not saying is avoid those guys. They have valuable input. They can tell you how their technology does things. They can actually guide you in terms of how to get those systems implemented. And a lot of them can tell you what are some of the changes that you can make in your organization to utilize those technologies effectively. So that can be a good start. What I'm saying is don't start there.
Yeah.
Start with the problems that you're trying to solve and work your way backwards into what are the technologies that you need. But then once you select those, what are those technologies that you need, then you can work with those technology providers and they become good partners. And ideally you partner with them effectively to drive that change.
Well, and it makes it easier for them to be a good partner as well. When you have a well-defined understanding of what you're working to accomplish, and you can define that, and they can say, well, this is how we would approach that, and why we're, different than somebody else, or have, our value versus somebody else. That's you have educated buyers and educated sellers working together in a much more synergistic way. Because oftentimes people will get in and they'll try to force something in, and whether that's because it's ill-defined up front or there's any other intent, but you end up taking the core and extending and extending and extending. Next thing you know, you have something that's, the solution is sort of a hobgoblin of the technology. It's just not what it started out to be or what it could have been if you properly defined it the way that you outlined it.
Yeah, and the metaphor of the hammer and the nail, right? If all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. That's what I'm trying to avoid with this.
Yeah.
Is if you start with the technology, then you're saying, okay, I've got a hammer, let's go look for nails. But what you're really trying to do is to build something. And so look at that first and then figure out what are the tools that you need.
And we've been seeing, we've had some other practitioners on this program talking about the fact that they get this, that they're leading this way, that people are looking for somebody to come in and help them define the problem space better, define what the outcomes could be, and then, to Mike's point, find the right technology that comes along and support that. So I think you're right in line with what we're hearing.
One thing to add to the reflection here as well, a lot of times, because you don't understand the technology, if you can afford to, as a company, bringing in technology to learn about it, creating a lab, if you will, where you can fiddle. I'm going to use the word fiddle with the technology, because a lot of times we don't know how it can help us solve our problems, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a place where having some fun with technology for technology's sake, if you will, there's a place for that, I think, but it's not on a grand scale, without understanding the problem you want to solve. So a lot of times, I guess I've heard people talk about, and I tend to agree with this, that if, again, for larger companies that can afford to do this, creating a lab where you can bring in technology, see what it can do for you, so that when you have those problems, that this may be a solution or an option for you. Otherwise, it's hard, because you need to have all these experts, and it isn't always easy to know what you don't know, so to speak, without doing that.
Right. And I think there's an opportunity for smaller and mid-sized companies that don't have the resources of a large company to create this lab and so forth, to work within some of the existing structures, whether it's regional cooperatives or MEPs or
Yes.
organizations like that,
Yep.
to kind of band together to work on these things as a group, to simulate those resources that larger companies would have.
That's a great point, and we see a lot of examples of that throughout, at least throughout the ecosystems I know we're close to. So
Right.
that's excellent. We've been talking for quite some time now, and I know we've been on for 45 minutes. Maybe we can begin to think through kind of just how we want to wrap up. And Mike, I don't know if you have another question or ready to share maybe a last thought or a perspective on our discussion today, but I'll open it up to you to take it from there.
I think we're just getting warmed up. I'm ready to go for another couple of hours. I guess the thing that I would say to folks is that Tim's a perfect example of the type of people that are out there with experience, with the right outlook. And we'll ask him at the end to give his credentials or his contact information, how you can track him down and those sorts of things. But I guess this conversation around value, this conversation around understanding where you are, where you want to go, and then putting the technology in the right place is absolutely the right conversation to be having with people. And I guess the challenge I would throw out to people, or the call that I would make to people, is that you're going to have to find people that you can trust. And so even if you're not going out today and considering buying a project or selling leadership on buying something, getting involved in groups like this and discussions like this, being linked in with Tim, looking at his videos, following who he follows. I mean, this is all part of a process, I think, of people starting for themselves individually and hopefully beyond for their companies, to say, look, we have to know this stuff. We have to know people who know this stuff, because we're going to have to build together, ecosystems that get us where we want to go. So it's not really a distinct takeaway from today's conversation, Mike. I apologize for that, but I'm just so thoroughly behind what Tim does and how he does it, that I would just encourage everybody to follow along, get to know him, and continue to jump into conversations like this.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Any other last thoughts before we pass it to Tim to give us his final thoughts?
No, I'll shut up now.
Okay, thanks. You don't have to, but thank you anyway. Tim, final thoughts for the audience before we wrap up here.
You mentioned the phrase "begin with the end in mind" earlier. I'm of that age where I'm a big fan of Stephen Covey and 7 Habits as well. So definitely begin with the end in mind. Work your way backwards from that business case to the things that you need to implement in order to drive the change that you're looking for. Keep the culture in mind. What are the specific behaviors that you want to be different in the future, and then work your way backwards to what are the technologies I can put in place that are going to support those behaviors. Think through adoption and think through how you're actually going to get people utilizing these technologies that you put in place. And a lot of that is, what are those specific behaviors that I'm looking for? And, what are the standard work that I want to put in place, not just for the operators, but, for my engineers, for my IT people, for all the different support groups and so forth. And how does that standard work get impacted by putting these technologies in place? How, for my, Toyota had the Toyota production system, for my company's production system, whether it's formal or informal, how does putting these things make a difference in that production system and all the different aspects of that and so forth? And so those are the things that you have to think about as you go into these projects. And those are the things that are really going to, over the long term, drive the impact for your organization. It's not the specific technologies that you're putting in place. It's how you're supporting improvements in those different processes. In terms of,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
In terms of how you can reach me, to Mike's earlier point, I'm on LinkedIn. I've got a decent presence here. You can reach out to me at, I'm Tim Stuart, or you can look up Visual Decisions and you'll find me that way. If you go to YouTube and search for Visual Decisions on YouTube, there's over 80 webinars on there around these different topics. And you can waste an awful lot of time watching those videos. And you can also reach out to me through email, tim@visualdecisions.com.
Great, Tim. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, and I have to admit I've been watching the LinkedIn exchange, and I shared some of the comments between Sonia Das and Rhiannon Gallagher, Joanne Friedman, Alan Zhu, and Karen Rivera. There's been quite a lively sidebar conversation as well that we've sparked, which is I've not normally seen that in these broadcasts. So, Tim, thank you for creating the opportunity for those folks to exchange and listen to what we've had to say. So it's wonderful, and for them to take time out of the day to join us has been great. So this has been the Industry 4.0 Club fireside chat. Mike Yost and I have been able to spend the last 50 minutes or so with Tim Stuart. Tim is the owner and principal with Visual Decisions and has a wealth of really over 2 decades of experience in helping to integrate Lean and Industry 4.0 and really help companies achieve better business results. So, Tim, thank you for that. If you like these sort of broadcasts, our Industry 4.0 Club, we hold them regularly. We have a couple of series, Women in Manufacturing, The Future of Manufacturing, and, of course, Fireside Chat. We're going to be also present coming up here soon at the end of October 24th to 26th at South Tech for the SESME national meeting as well here in Greenville, South Carolina. So come meet us there, and we look forward to talking with you. And hope everybody has a great day. Thank you, Tim, again, and Mike, for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Everybody.
Bye-bye.